got a cap on your...
Yeah. Start again.
You can start. Yeah? Okay. Do you want to ask me?
Did everybody hear the question? No. Okay, so the question is, when was the first time that she was fascinated by desire, both literally and metaphorically?
See, when you ask a question like that, you're assuming that desire is a thing, a separate thing, that you can one day wake up and say, oh, I had my first pineapple, so I'm suddenly interested in pineapple. Desire is not a pineapple. Right? It is something that affects every aspect of your life, every aspect of your daily life, and it does so cumulatively as well as individually. So it's not like you can get up one day and say, wake up one morning and say, I'm interested in desire. Desire doesn't care if you're interested in it or not. It's going to affect you anyway. And so you can choose to think about it and study it like I did, but that's because it does affect you all the time. So I have always been marked by desire. I mean, as you know, when you're born, you're not allowed to leave the hospital without a birth certificate that states what your gender is, for instance. And the minute it states what your gender is, it's also making a whole lot of assumptions about what your desire is going to be sexually. And that in turn affects a lot of the social desires that are placed on you and political desires that are placed on you. So there is no, you are not without desire. The only space for us to be in is in the space of desire. And so I've always been in it. I've always thought about it, always studied it.
Did you find Shakespeare through desire, or did desire find you through Shakespeare?
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be the former, no? Since I just sort of said how we're always in desire. But I don't know when. I mean, I think I was one of those annoying people who always knew what she wanted to do, and I always knew I wanted to study Shakespeare. And when I went to start my PhD in the US, and I remember my advisor saying to me, you know, people have been writing about Shakespeare for over 400 years, so you need to see what twist you can bring to it, if you can bring something different. And I think that really pushed me into thinking about Shakespeare the way I do now, which is really thinking about it very much as a cluster of what the language does, what the politics does, what the ethics does, and bringing those together to think about desire.
Speaking of bringing things together, Professor Jonathan, you've always been fascinated by the idea of masala. So you read the world through masala in some way. You also read yourself personally through masala. So when is it that you begin to, you acquired some form of knowledge about reading this through masala?
I mean, again, like Madhvi, masala was not a concept that came sort of packaged as something self-evident. I had to sort of fumble my way towards it. Partly because I was born in New Zealand, and so there was no concept of masala whatsoever, both in the entertainment sense, but also in the kitchen sense. One of the best reasons to leave New Zealand is the food. But I think over the years, it's a little bit like Madhvi's interest in design. My sense that the basic ingredient of the world, and I'm not speaking here culinarily, but just conceptually, was not a unit like an atom. And at least in the West, we're trained to break things down to something irreducible and singular. And there was something about that always felt a little bit wrong to me. And it had probably a bit to do with my own background as the child of a mixed marriage. When I was growing up in New Zealand, the neighbors would always ask me, are you Protestant or Catholic? As if those were the two boxes you could tick. And you know, I was neither. And so I'd go to my mother, who's Jewish, and I'd say, Mum, are we Protestant or Catholic? And she'd say, in Jewish fashion, I'll tell you what we are. So I'd go back to the friends and say, we're Catholic. But I felt, it wasn't a sort of blazing desire, but I felt like to be legible to other people, I had to boil myself down to one identity. But it always felt like an act of violence. And although I was brought up Jewish, the fact is, I wasn't brought up religiously Jewish, I was brought up culturally Jewish. I wasn't fully Jewish because my father isn't Jewish. And so I always felt like I didn't quite fit the Jewish box. I was packaged off to Jewish youth groups when I was small, and I thought, I'm not quite Jewish enough. I'd say I'm Jew-ish. But then I didn't sort of quite fit the New Zealand box completely either. And for a long time I thought, this is a problem. I need to work out who I am. So I developed this completely phantasmatic sense of myself as really English, even though there wasn't anything English about me. What I was reading was English, the music I was listening to was English, the TV programs I was watching were English. So when I went to England in 1987 to do my PhD, I can still remember as the plane was landing, I was saying to myself, England, my England, as if I was returning home something that would give me a singular identity, and I was quickly disabused of that because English people, as soon as they heard my accent, would say, where are you from? Colonial. So after a while, I began to realize, not only am I mixed, we're all mixed. No matter how much we may come from some sort of should sense of our clan, our community. We're all the product of not one but two parents. And that means that the irreducible number in our formation is not one. We're not atoms, we're molecules. Molecules precede atoms, and you have to commit violence against molecules to produce pure atoms. And there was something about coming to India that really confirmed that sense, that mixture is the basic element. Mind you, this was an India that I fear is in danger of not existing anymore. I mean, it still exists, but the dominant discourses are increasingly about singularity. So it's the parts of India that still cherish syncretism, pluralism, more than oneness, neighbors who are not the same as you but somehow contribute to your identity because of the fact that they're your neighbors. That is to me something absolutely valuable that I cherish, whether it's in my entertainment or in my sense of how identity works or doesn't work.
Okay, so the next question is, Kama Sutra is read as a text that is both feminist and sexist. So in a way it prescribes a lot of things, but at the same time it also states that in moments of desire, one can do anything that one wants to. So is it possible to negotiate between these two interpretations?
Negotiate, yes. Decide, no.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to sort of say, this is the truth and that is not the truth, I think that's an impossibility. But I think it is testimony to the complexity of desire itself that this text is both. And I don't know how many of you have read the Kama Sutra, but it is actually an extremely boring text because it just sort of goes on and on for hours about weird things. I mean, the things that I happen to be interested in, so it tells you sort of how you should decorate your space and what the ideal, where the bed should be kept, where the bookshelves should be kept. And I think we should actually all pay more attention to that. But otherwise, it's really a dry manual of all the arts and skills that you need to develop in order to be a good lover. So that's sort of the book on sexual positions. This is 1 out of 6 books, so it's really the minority of that book. But of course, most people don't read the Kama Sutra, and we just assume we know what it is without reading it. It's probably the book in the world that everyone thinks they know without having read it. And so it is. What is fascinating to me is that when we read it, we say easily either that it is a sexist text because it says repeatedly. I mean, its protagonist is the man about town, so it doesn't really talk about women, except of course that it does. And it devotes 3 books to courtesans and women who earn their living sexually. And it is very clear that such women are not only to be respected, but they're powerful, and that they're to be respected because they're individuals, because they're economically free, that this is their way of being financially independent. And so it has long instructions for how to cheat a really creepy lover because he doesn't deserve to keep his money in any case. And so the sympathy is very much on the side of the woman. And there is zero judgment about her using sex as her profession. There is absolutely no judgment. So how do you slot such a book? And the Kama Sutra itself is very interested in slotting things because it sort of says, there are 3 different types of men, 3 different types of women, and then it'll get into each category, it's sort of very biological that way, gets into each category, and then it'll say, actually then there are 5 other subcategories, and then there are 12 other subcategories, and then forget about it. There are these categories and more. So it's always giving us both a specific answer, but also leaving the door open to a bigger answer and a more complex reading. Because of course we want classification because we want things to be easy. I mean, who doesn't want life to be easier than it is? But the Kama Sutra will sort of say, I hear you. I know that you want things to be simple. But unfortunately I can't give you that. And it does it with wit and with love. So I think we get drawn into that very easily.
So since we're speaking of how Kama Sutra tries to categorize things, and then we also, and I think if anything that we learned from this course is that we can't exist in binaries and categories. So but in a world that we live in, like you said, that there are people who are still intermingling, but there are also people who still are largely xenophobic. So how is it that we begin to respond to these opposing realities in some way?
Well, it's an ongoing question. I'm not sure I have easy answers. Teaching courses like this is one small step. I'm not a megalomaniac who thinks he's going to be able to convince the Sangha Parivar that they should all marry Muslims and produce mixed children. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the solution either. But I think people need to read more. I think people need to study history more. And I think people need to get off Facebook and Instagram. I'm a great one to talk. But what I'm seeing with the rise of social media, I do think social media is not fully but partly responsible for the intensification of a certain kind of default opinionism. And one goes on Facebook in order to find people who have exactly the same opinion and will affirm it and click like on it. And we somehow feel narcissistically wounded if we don't get enough likes. So we're subject to an entire machinery that is about reinforcing what we believe, rather than producing true spaces of conversation and critical scrutiny. Very few people go onto Facebook to have an actual conversation, what I call a conversation. But more and more, we don't have time for conversations, because conversations presume a certain kind of unboundedness. The possibility that this can't be resolved in a hurry. I think there are all sorts of contributing factors to our addiction to having answers straight away. The Indian education system contributes to that addiction too. The whole phenomenon of the kunji is just symptomatic of a larger desire to be in possession of the right answer now. And we're living in a time, unfortunately, where political discourse is increasingly controlled and artfully manipulated by those who offer the snake oil of instant answers. Here's the truth. Here's what's going on in your gown right now. This is what you need to attend to and get outraged by now, otherwise you're not in possession of the truth. If people can learn to pause, I always like to say, if people can learn to live on the left-hand side of the question mark, rather than rushing to the right-hand side, then we stand a better chance of thinking and getting on with each other. But it's one thing to say you should stay on the left-hand side of the question mark. It's another thing to make that culturally viable in a wholesale fashion. I've got no answers there.
And just to sort of add on to that, I mean, that's why some of us are not on Facebook or social media of any kind. And I recommend it.
Some people are very smug about it.
But I think what always baffles me is that this is not, we all know this is not how we live. We all know that our lives are complex, that our thoughts are complicated, that our personalities morph and mutate and change shape. I mean, this is not breaking news. We all know this already about ourselves. In fact, this is probably the only thing we know about ourselves. And then to pretend that, in fact, we are not complex, that we are simple and straightforward, that to me is baffling. So when people say, oh, you can't, all this talk about complexity, maybe in your university you can do it, and it's like, this is the only true thing in the world is that we are complex. And then to pretend that we are not, that actually takes a lot of labor. But we seem happy to perform that labor of denial of complexity and embrace of simplicity, which is just not the way we live.
So I was just to remember, I brought this up in class as well, that how we got Salo, and he talks about fascists are the true anarchists. So is it not possible to read this, let's say, singular narrative is also a form of anarchy and hence a loss of control there as well? Or why do we read it as always someone trying to control and create a singular narrative? It's probably a loss of control as well in some way.
Yes, but it's, it depends. A fascist is very different from, say, someone who says, like I've just said, that the truth about the world is that we're all complex. That too can sound like a single message, but it's a single message about multiplicity. A fascist message, and this is what qualifies it as fascism, a fascist message is always based on drawing a very, very harsh border around whatever idea or community or people you want to build, and subscribing to violent forms of keeping the other people or ideas at bay. Now, does that show insecurity? Of course it does. Does that show a desire, a fear of being out of control? Of course it does. We can say, oh, Hitler loved animals and was a vegetarian, but the fact still remains he was a hateful fascist. So I'm not sure what the politics are of saying that fascists are out of control rather than in control. If we want to say they're out of control in order to drum up sympathy for them, it's not a project I'm interested in. If we want to say they're out of control, in fact, to prove that their single narratives of the world are not true, then I'm all in favor of that.
You always look at desire as something that is dispersed all around us. Like, for example, in Infinite Variety, History of Desire Limited, you talk about how everything that we do is in some way or the other connected to desire. The way we do our hair, eat pan, all of that. So I would like to know how you would read asexuality then.
I mean, I have a chapter in this book, which of course you all have read. I have a chapter in this book on celibacy.
Yeah.
And a lot of people ask me the same question about that, which is how can you write about celibacy in a book on desire? And my sort of immediate answer always is that celibacy is very much in relation to desire, just as asexuality is in relation to sex. So just because you have the prefix A doesn't mean it's on a different planet. Right? There is a relationship there. And what is interesting to me about celibacy, for instance, is that it forces us to expand our relation to desire from the zone of genital sex alone. Because celibacy suggests I don't want to indulge in genital sex, but that doesn't mean I don't have desire. And in fact, at least in the histories of India, celibates have often been women who have used celibacy to escape the imperatives of heterosexual marriage and reproduction. So they don't want to be yoked to a man, they don't want to have children, and so they say, I'd rather be celibate, and because we are the civilizations that we are, inevitably that discourse takes a religious tinge. So I want to devote myself to God. There are lots of Sufi women saints who say that. Lots of Bhakti women saints who say that, including Mirabai, for instance, most famously. So religion becomes a way of saying, I'm married to God, which is convenient because God is not going to come and force you to have sex, right? Or to produce children. So that's great. So I'm married to God, and then people will leave you alone saying, oh, she's sort of answering a higher calling, so she doesn't need to do this. And so it removes us from that constraints of heteronormativity without removing us from the register of desire. So just because we don't have genital sex doesn't mean that we're removed from desire. And I think the same is true of asexuality as well.
Also, I'd also like to to ask about, since you wrote about the Shabrimala issue in the book,
Yeah.
and then there was a call with the Indian Express as well. So how was, what kind of criticism did you receive, especially because you wrote it, your opinions very clearly on that, and you're also from Kerala, and then you wrote about it. So what was the response that you got?
There was a criminal complaint filed against me, so I might have to go to court one of these days, but I'm hoping it won't come to that. First of all, it amuses me, and yes, you say I'm from Kerala, my family is I'm from Delhi, so I know very well that no one north of the Vindhyas has ever even heard of Ayyappan. So suddenly the whole country having an opinion on this arcane god is just hilarious. And so this person who's filed a criminal complaint against me also knows nothing about Kerala, but apparently says I have outraged the sentiments of lakhs and lakhs of Hindus. It's interesting that he thinks there are only lakhs of Hindus in the country, but whatever. Anyway, so first of all, it's like this has propelled Ayyappan to a kind of national fame that he did not have at all. So that is amusing to me. And the second thing that upsets people is just really the asking of a simple question, which I think we always should. One of the early gay rights slogans in the US, and this was on t-shirts and stickers and everything everywhere, is don't assume anything. Right? And so when we are saying Ayyappan is a celibate god, every statement I'm about to make is problematic, but I don't have time to go into all of them. When people are saying Ayyappan is a celibate god, therefore women of menstruating age who are therefore also sexually active should not come in his presence, the immediate assumption is that Ayyappan is attracted to women. Now the basic question you have to ask is, how do you know Ayyappan is attracted to women? That's just a basic question. You're not implying necessarily that he is gay in any way or anything of the kind. But so all I have said over and over again is that you have to ask yourselves that question before assuming automatically a chauvinistic, sexist, misogynistic position. And again, without going into too many details, the histories that we know around Ayyappan suggest a very close connection with other men, which does not automatically translate into misogyny. So again, why that idea of keeping women out? So it's we allow ourselves, again, maybe because we have so many things to do that it's easier for us, we allow ourselves to swallow narratives wholesale without questioning assumptions. But if we go by the slogan of assuming nothing, then that means we will always ask, where is this coming from? What is this based on? Who does this benefit? And these questions are automatically going to expand how we think about any issue, not just it.
Does anybody like to ask questions?
I have a question. Professor, you spoke about living with difference and living in difference in things. Can you just speak about it a little?
So, there are obviously a number of ways of talking about what it means to live with difference. If one starts off with an atomic view of the self, one presumes that living with difference would involve people of this identity living next door to people of that identity. And this is a very American view, by the way, of living together. That you've got Italian Americans who live with other hyphenated Americans, and they all respect their cultural traditions in a colorful rainbow of pluralism. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But if you think about living with difference from a molecular point of view, it means also recognizing difference within oneself, not just as an external factor. Of course, there are differences between me and you, but there are also differences within me and within you. And one can either try to suppress the fact of those differences within oneself, say, I am should, I am only this, or one can try and turn that multiplicity into a virtue of some kind. I think that there's also a third kind of living with difference, And I've been alluding to it in classes with you and also today. But it is to recognize that I am not just my clan. And by that, I don't mean I am an individual, a free change agent, but I am very much part of a larger ecology that involves people, creatures, things that don't just belong to my designated community. And that ecology means that these various other elements are also part of me in some way. I was very moved, for instance, once when I read an essay by a friend. She had grown up in Nizamuddin, and she ostensibly comes from a Hindu family. She herself is from a mixed marriage. Her mother is a UP Hindu. Her father is a Tambram. But she said, growing up in Nizamuddin made me partly Muslim. Now, by that she doesn't mean that she has had the kind of experience of political and cultural marginalization that so many Muslims have had. But she is recognizing that being part of a district like Nizamuddin meant that she had experiences that go beyond her simple designated clan. And that is true not just of her, but of every one of us. If we can be a little bit more inclusive about what I is, and make it not just the answer to a census form question, saying tick this box but not the others. It allows us both to recognize multiplicity in the world and in ourselves, but also to recognize that we are more than simply where our bodies stop and the world begins. That we are always in conversation with what is around us. So that's what I mean about living in difference as well as living with difference. We're living not just with other people who are different from us, we're living in a world where difference is in some ways the organizing principle, even for the sense of the I. The I is what it is not just because it's different from other people, but the I is different even from itself. And that may sound a little bit abstract, but to relate to something that Madhvi was just saying, this is in fact, I think, our lived reality. There's a way in which we can recognize what may seem like some abstract theoretical point about living in difference. We can recognize it as part of the everyday reality that we all live in. And I think actually Indians are in a better position to recognize that than many people in the world, precisely because no matter how much the powers that be may be speaking about Indian civilization in the singular, we've always been an assortment of civilizations. There have always been so many colors in the Indian palette. And rather than picking orange over green, or white over orange and green, I'd like to think that we could incorporate all these colors, and not in the American neatly organized rainbow fashion, but in all that sort of murky but creative potential as well. You mix orange and green, you get a new color, and that's fantastic. But India, for the subcontinent for thousands of years, has been a place of confluence, of meeting point between so many different cultures and languages. And we're forgetting that now. But I think it's a huge asset. And again, at the level of everyday experience, I talked about this with you in class, the fact that not a single one of you, unless I'm mistaken, is monolingual. And in your everyday experience, every one of you transitions between English and Hindi, or English and Bengali, or English and Tamil, or maybe even English and Hindi and Urdu and Punjabi and Bhojpuri. That is a virtue. Rather than trying to build fences around languages and say, that is my mother tongue and that is who I am, we should acknowledge the fact that we actually have many parents beyond our biological parents. There are many mothers we have. And so it can augment our sense of ourselves and the world we live in. So did you believe in the